The topic of this presentation is race and racism, and to start with I might give you an example from 1700s Southeast Asia when white colonisers went to the Orient, as they called it. They would take up local customs, speak the local language, maybe take a local wife, celebrate local holidays. If we skip forward 200 years, by 1900 white colonisers would have abhorred this kind of behaviour. They would have seen it as going native and as a terrible thing. They saw themselves as belonging to a superior category of person, of human, whose job it was to bring up the natives, to enlighten them and bring them out of their backward state. In other words, they viewed the humans as being composed of races, such as white, yellow, red and black, or Aryan and Jew. And these races were hierarchically arranged. White was at the top and black was at the bottom. White was most advanced, black was most backward. So that's a racist perception. Racism is the perception that the world is divided, that the humans are divided into different categories and a hierarchy of categories. So anthropologists are interested in people who have this idea of race and people who are racists, and interested to understand where this comes from. We have some sorts of background to this idea. Ethnocentrism is a common word in anthropology. Ethnocentrism basically means judging the rest of the world in terms of your own culture. And that's quite normal. As a boy, I heard that the French people eat frogs. I think frogs are disgusting, so I thought the French people were disgusting. That's an example of a boyish ethnocentrism. It can take a much more radical form. For example, people who feel that everybody else is barbarians, that my people are the only people, and everybody else is barbarians. And we find this, for example, also like in the Western Desert in Australia, where as Tonkinson talks about the Mardu people from around Jigalong in Western Australia, think of themselves as the true people and others as not really people, other groups as not really people. So the ethnocentric perception is common in all kinds of societies. It probably could be contrasted, though not clearly, but roughly contrasted with cosmopolitanism. And cosmopolitanism is an idea of embracing different cultures and embracing difference. While there are many cultures that have a sense of ethnocentrism, there's the opposite notion sometimes prevails in cultures, which could be called cultural cringe. It's a rarely used word and not used at all, I think, in anthropology, which just means feeling that one's culture is a little bit backward or a bit less valid. In Australia, this happened in the 1950s. Australians, we thought of ourselves as less valid or less advanced than British people, for example, and that's cultural cringe. Now, as far as racism itself, most of the advances in our study of why people have this idea that the human world is comprised of races, most of our advances have come from the study of colonies. So we have a series of thinkers in the 1960s, French-speaking thinkers, Manoni, Memmi, Fannon, who were interested in how colonised people assumed that they were inferior. How did black people in Algeria or Morocco come to assume that they were less advanced, less clever, more backward than French people? And of course there's not much validity to those ideas. For example, we have more evidence of advanced civilizations in North America than circa 1000, probably there were more advanced writing and so on in the north parts of Africa than certain parts of rural France. So we know historically this idea is not valid, and yet black people in Morocco and Algeria came to convince themselves that they were backward. So these guys talked about inferiority complex and looked and drew on Freudian ideas such as the Oedipus complex, so that black people who were colonized saw whites as a kind of Oedipal father and so on. These days the idea seems a bit dated and a bit strange, the criticisms, and it seems, but they actually made quite a lot of inroads, I think, into understanding how racism develops. More famously, you get the work of Edward Said and his work Orientalism. And this is more influenced by the scholar Foucault. So Said looks at how Westerners came up with this idea of an other. There was the West and then there was the East. And to get a sense of what the West was as rational, the East needed to be irrational, the West needed to be advanced, the East needed to be backward, etc. And through colonies, they made this image real. They made people in the Orient or in Africa fill these backward roles in order for themselves to be forward. Now, I probably don't need to remind you of this, but for most of history, at least up to 1500, China, for example, the technology and all the markers of what people might call civilization were far advanced of those in Western Europe. And yet, as is common with ethnocentrism, Western Europeans from 1500 on managed to convince themselves that they were superior. And then from about 1800s, not only that they were superior, but that they were a different kind of human being. So to return to this initial question, in 1700s, the white colonizer in Southeast Asia who took on the local costumes and local customs and so on, he thought of himself as superior but not as of a different race. By 1900, the colonizers thought of themselves as being of a different race, which means not only that they were of a different kind of breed, but they had a higher morality, they had better virtues, such as they were more honest. So white people were honest, cleverer, more advanced, and so on. So that was a new idea that emerged sometime I think in the 1800s, though some people would say it was earlier. So people like Fannon and Memmi tried to understand it from a psychoanalytical approach. Said took Foucault's approach to how knowledge becomes related to power. If you have an idea of the Oriental person as somewhat less and backward, that translates into power, into making them backward. And that's a complicated idea which I don't have time to expand on here. Another more recent idea comes from Latrobe's own lately deceased, sad to say he's passed away, Patrick Wolfe, who takes a Marxist approach to race. And there's a very interesting article where he compares the roles of African slaves and Indians or First Nations in the United States. He says with regards to the Indians, there was a logic of elimination. The white colonizers needed land, they needed empty land. So the logic was to get rid of the Indians. And there was two ways to get rid of them. One was to directly kill them, and we know they did that. But the other was to assimilate them into the white population. So the theory was there that with only a little bit of white blood, one grandparent or something, you could become white if you were an Indian. He contrasts this with black people, the slaves. The slaves, he argued, for the white elite, the slaves needed to be kept separate and maintained. They needed the labour of the slaves. Where they needed the land of the Indians, they needed the labour of the slaves. So the slaves needed to be kept and maintained. So with that, there was a different logic, not of elimination, but logic which sometimes called miscegenation, which is the mixing of races. And the rule was that if you have one drop of black, it was the one drop rule. If you have one drop of black in your blood, God forbid, then you are black yourself. And by doing that, white people managed to maintain a black slave population, but also eliminate the traditional owners, if you like, of the land. So that's his argument based on Marxist principles. I think the argument is flawed in certain ways, and I've blogged on that, and I'll put up a link for that. So the general position within anthropology is that race does not exist, that race is a made-up concept in certain cultures used to explain typically the superiority of a certain person. And if you want to, you can go to the American Anthropological Association's statement on race, which basically says race is not real, but racism, a perception, that humans belong to different categories is real. And this is not surprising because as an anthropologist myself, we tend to emphasize nurture over nature. I should get it right, it's my job. We tend to, as a cultural anthropologist, we tend to emphasize nurture over nature. So what we're interested in is we don't really care with what genes you've been born with. We think that the situation that you're raised in will have more effect on how you turn out than the genes you were born with. And that's the typical anthropological approach. And that's how we explain, for example, why culture is different in Indonesia to Argentina to Alaska, because of the culture and not because of some sort of gene pool. So it's not surprising, thus, that anthropologists think that race is a phony concept. So while we're talking about this, I should also say what race isn't. Race isn't ethnicity. Ethnicity is a concept that anthropologists still use. We're pretty sketchy about it and not too happy with the idea of ethnicity itself, and I'll get into that in another presentation. But for the meantime, say ethnic group, we just identify as somebody who has the same language, cultures and customs, that kind of thing. Normally that'll do for a ethnic group. And so we accept the reality and we use this notion of ethnicity. So the relevance for us is that believing that there are races, certain people are able to exert power and control over others by casting themselves as one kind of race and other people as other kinds of races, and being able to convince those other people that they belong to, for example, an inferior race. And that helps us to explain the disadvantage, discrimination and suffering in some places of the world. So, to return to our example again of these two colonisers, in 1700 there's a man who's adapted to the local customs, and in 1900 there's a man who feels like he's completely separate kind of human being to the ones around him in the colony. So the people haven't changed particularly. What has changed is a new idea of race, which was tied up with Darwinian ideas of evolution. The idea was that white people were more advanced than Asian people or black people and so on. Now, of course, according to Darwin, there's no such thing as a more advanced species of any sort. There's just adaptations to different environments. But this kind of neo-Darwinism, as it's called, even though it has nothing to do with what Darwin wrote, had started to preponderate in the thought of colonizers and white people, if you like, people in Europe and the West. And that explains that idea, that racist idea, explains the power and dispossession that they were able to exert.